there was some discussion about the Indian Act. And in my notes, I have some notes on the Indian Act. And Rary already talked about the policy behind it. And I want to emphasize what he already said, is that what the Indian Act wanted to do is to do away with Indian people, as they're called in the Indian Act. Want to do away with it, to get rid of people. So there were three main policies. The old policy, get rid of Indian status. The other one was save money. And the other one was push the responsibility to the provinces. And in my comments, you'll see how that has been implemented. I'll come back to that. So there was unconscionable control over the people who were put on reserve. And the only reason for the survival of treaty nations is because people refused to submit to it. And that's the legacy that you have as you ask yourselves, what are we going to do next? You have a legacy that your parents, your ancestors have refused to disappear under a policy that had that goal. It didn't work. You're still here. So I think it's important to view the enterprise here as one of, resistance and survival, and that's what I want to talk about, just to mention some general points that might be helpful as you think these things through and make the decisions that only you can make. In the materials that you're going to get by email, there are lists of the attempts at changing the Indian Act. So I'm not going to go through that. It can be relatively boring in a way like so. You can read all about it, okay? So I'm going to skip that part. Let me just say this, that there have been attempts to get rid of the Indian Act, including some of my friends who are here today have been involved in a particular Manitoba venture, the Framework Initiative. Where's Robert Wavy there? I saw him earlier, but he's probably going somewhere. And other people who were involved in the Framework Initiative. That was one of the attempts to eliminate, the control of the Indian Act. But there have been a number of them. What has remained is generally the new legislation that is opt-in legislation. That is, people have the option of coming under that new legislation. I want to talk now about something important, which is the new policy. So that was the old policy. What's the new policy now? We introduced it, and I think the Treaty Commissioner talked about it. Nation to nation. What does that mean? In the Royal Commission that I served on, we addressed that question. And we came up with a definition of a nation for purposes of self-government. Nobody's paid much attention to it. You can read that too when you get the email, or you can read the RCAP final report. I won't go through all of that. What I want to do is to offer some of my thoughts about how can we turn this idea of nation-to-nation relationship to good use in your negotiations with the government. I have looked at many definitions of nation. Many of them. I cannot find a definition of a nation that makes sense in the context of this federal policy. I can't. For example, nation to nation, what about Quebec? The Harper government passed a resolution in Parliament saying there's a Quebecois nation. So which nation is dealing with whom? I can't find anything like that. So I gave up. So I said there's another way, and this is my way. I think there's another way you can eliminate a lot of the complicated language, and you can arrive at the same ideas. And it's this. Never mind trying to find a nation, because the government is dealing with all kinds of organizations anyway, including Indian Act bands. So how can we think about nation to nation? And my suggestion is this. Look for the principles, look for the ideas that apply when you have two artificial nations that are free, independent, and equal. So to me, you don't need all the jargon about, that you usually hear. And instead, conceptualize, think about two nations dealing with one another that are independent, free, and equal. Well, what would that yield? All right. Well, first of all, one nation does not set the rules. There you go. Another idea would be, well, there are no limitations. There are no limitations on any party. The two nations are equal. So one nation does not limit what it is prepared to negotiate with another nation. The only limitations that apply where you have free, independent, and equal nations are those limitations that have two features. You've probably thought about them already, because I think this is all very straightforward. The first one is that they've been specified. And the second one is they've been agreed. So the only limitations on your power, your authority, your dignity are those to which you have agreed because they have been laid before you and you've consented to them. And one of the points that I like to emphasize is the principle of consent. The principle of consent is not well understood. Where do I look when I want to find the best ideas for treaty nations? There's not much in the jurisprudence, in the cases, or in philosophy. In the Canadian courts, there's not a lot. But when I'm looking for acknowledgement of power, of political power, I ask, who do the courts respect out of fear or love? And how do they deal with their interests? For example, Quebec, and English and French minority language rights. You know that the Supreme Court of Canada has got 3 judges from Quebec because they're French and they've got a different civil law system. So I lost my train of thought. I was dealing with the principles of a nation to nation relationship, yes, and I was going to emphasize the point of consent. What the courts have said is this: consent is the basis for constitutional legitimacy. The Constitution is the basic law of Canada. No government can do anything against the Constitution. The Constitution sets out the powers of government. It limits the powers of government. And the courts have said consent is the basis of constitutional legitimacy. If the governed have not consented to it, it's not legitimate. It's de facto. That is, it operates so that you can't go back after, when it's legitimized, you can't go back and throw the people in jail. You have to legitimize it. It's called the de facto doctrine. So that was not developed in the treaty nation law. That was developed in provincial French minority language rights in Manitoba. The first major case on that was the Manitoba Language Reference Case of 1985. And then there's a long line of cases in the Supreme Court of Canada that follow that. And for those who are interested in the paper that I have, I wrote a paper in a law journal in New Zealand on these ideas, so you can read all about it at some other time. So that is one contribution that I make, is I try to suggest that the nation-to-nation relationship is typical, ambiguous, uncertain talk, because different people have a different thing in mind when they say nation. And I can't find any notion that would make everybody happy. So there you go. That's one idea. One of the suggestions that I have is for constitutional change. Remember I said the Constitution says who has power, who has what power, and what are the limits to that power. Now, if Treaty 5 says you have self-government power, but if the rest of the Constitution says, oh no, it's the provinces and the federal government that have power, how are you going to make the two work together? My view is this. What ought to be done by treaty nations like yourselves who want to get ahead, and this involves all First Nations across the country, you should develop amendments to the Constitution. Constitutional reform is absolutely essential. And I say, if you don't have constitutional change, you're not going to achieve a proper state-indigenous relationship. You need constitutional reform. Now, there's two basic kinds of constitutional reform. One is a straightforward amendment. For example, I'll take one that Rory mentioned, the Northwest Territory Order of June 1870. Well, if you look at Section 35.1 of the Constitution Act 1982, it says that Aboriginal leaders are to be invited at a national conference to discuss a constitutional amendment which involves the following: Section 35, Section 91, 24, blah, blah, blah. What's missing? The Northwest Territory Order. And Ray talked about the significance of the Northwest Territory Order. But it's not in the list of things that are to kick in the national conference on constitutional reform. As Ray mentioned, a lot of people don't know about that order. It's kind of in a schedule, kind of in the middle of the constitutional documents. But let me tell you, there's a lot of strange things in the Constitution of Canada, including sawdust and wood chips too. If you don't believe me, you can find that schedule, and I can send it to you by email. But our Constitution has wood chips and sawdust in it. It has to do with Section 92, capital A, which has to do with natural resources, and the schedule gives us a definition. But I remember I laughed hard when I heard about that. We're probably the only constitution in the world that has sawdust in it. I want to briefly review some of the events and recent constitutional developments to give you the context in which you're going to have to think about creating institutions. But before I do, I want to say a quick word about the UN Declaration that has been mentioned before, and one of the important meanings. I have this in the notes that I'm sending. I explain the meaning of quite a number of words that are very commonly used. I just don't have time to go through all of them. But I want to mention just one, and it's the word people. And you can see here, S. And I brought this, I was a teacher many decades ago. This is show and tell. This is actually an actual paper that I've kept at home since the 1990s when I was in Geneva. The point of this is very important, but it's disrespected all the time in things that I read that people write in Canada because they don't understand English. They don't understand English. people means the people in this room. So people can mean kind of like persons. You know, you say one person, you know, there's many people here. That's individuals. But a people is a special thing. A people is a large group of people with all kinds of things in common, like the Cree people, the Anishinaabe people, you know, that meaning. And that one has a plural meaning, peoples. So if you have the Cree and the Ojibwe getting together, you have two peoples getting together. But you'll see in a lot of even public forums, even speeches, government speeches, you'll see peoples where they mean people. So we're trying to deal with that confusion. And the point is that what we were emphasizing at the United Nations is that the rights that we are dealing with are human rights, but they are human rights that are held by the community. So here I'm talking about what you're embarking on is a new challenge in the development of the state indigenous peoples relationship as a collectivity. No one has a right of self-government. I don't have a right of self-government. You don't have a right of self-government. You don't have a right of self-government. Who has a right of self-government? The community. So Treaty 5, arguably, or the Cree people, or the Dene people, up to you to decide, has a right of self-government, because the right is not held by individuals, it's held by the community. So these are some of the ideas and the distinctions that you have to understand in order to create those institutions. And if I had more time, and you can read about them in the notes, subject. What's the difference between a subject and a citizen, for example? One of the things that I always scratch my head about is why do people refer to First Nation citizens? Citizens wasn't an idea until Peace of Westphalia in 1648, I imagine. It has to do with the relationship between the state and the individuals that are governed by the state. So I'm wondering why do treaty nations use that? It's not up to me to say, but I'm sure that people have their own ideas of what's the right relationship between your community and the individual that belongs to it. I don't know, but it's up to the elders and others to determine that. So it's one of the questions that I have. Let me point out something very important in constitutional doctrine and law that was decided in 2014, 4 years ago, in two cases, the Grassy Narrows case and the Chilcotin case. And in these cases, the court made it clear that the law has changed a lot. The law of the Constitution has changed. Remember I said the Constitution allocates power and it limits power. So in the Grassy Narrows case, the court explained that Canada is a federal system. The federal government, parliament, can make laws about certain things. The provinces can make laws about other things. So the court decided in the Grassy Narrows that the provinces have the obligation to implement the treaties within their spheres of jurisdiction, which means within their authority. For example, natural resources. You know that sawdust and wood chips schedule that I mentioned? That's 92A, that's about natural resources and who can tax them. And these very important powers belong to the provinces. So you have to remember that when you're dealing with the federal government, you're dealing with a federal policy now, nation to nation. But it'll never be complete. Once you get to the negotiating table and you talk about natural resources and so on, you say, well, you've got to talk to the province, you see? So what has happened here through the courts is a major change because the historic policy was one of protection of treaty nations, protection of all the indigenous people. And that policy of protection meant that the government would keep away from the local level of government the power to deal with the lands and the interests of the indigenous people. And that's why we have Section 9124 of the Constitution Act 1867, which says that it's the federal parliament that has the power over what's called Indians and Indian lands. But you see, the courts have changed that. The courts have changed that. They've now said, yeah, but the provinces have that power. So that old policy of protection by keeping the power away from the local people has been taken away. So that's a huge change in Canada's constitutional history, and it's a monumental change in the state-indigenous relationship. It has tremendous significance. So that's one of the reasons that I say constitutional change is necessary. The question is, who is going to decide the state-indigenous relationship? Who is going to decide the relationship between Treaty 5 and Canada? Is it the judges that were appointed by the government? The judges sit on Canada's courts. Who do you think they're bound to side with? So you have to change the Constitution. That's why I say you need constitutional amendment. And that's one of the reasons. And my suggestion would be this. When we participated in the constitutional reform meetings in the 1980s, there's a lot of pressure when you try to come up in meetings, come up with a position, come up with a view. That pressure is not there right now. Because if I said we should do it right away, people say, that Chartrand is crazy. You said, because nobody's going to accept it because it'll wake up Quebec separatism and all this kind of thing. So what I'm saying, well, isn't it a good time for treaty nations then to get together and to come to a common position on the kinds of constitutional changes that are needed? So that's one point. The other point is this. The constitution of a country is a very complicated thing. You can change it by your political action. I've already talked about constitutional amendment. That's governed by certain provisions of the Constitution Act 82. But there's another way to change it. The way, for example, that the office of the Prime Minister came to life, came to be a part of the way that power is distributed in Canada. You will not find the word Prime Minister in the Constitution of Canada until 1982. And then they gave him the job of calling a meeting. So how did the Prime Minister's office become so important in Canada's constitutional makeup? So important that the people who are experts in this call Canada the least democratic of the democracies. I'm not making this up. You just read the most well-known political scientists. This is their conclusion. And I've read at least 2 books on the matter that say, because of the concentration of power in the office of the Prime Minister, Canada is not a real democracy according to particular standards. And you understand that. So these are things, this is an office that has a lot of power, and it got there through political action. A lot of the modern trend was started by Pierre Trudeau. And it's become worse and worse in the sense if you don't like centralization of power, or better and better if you like it. But this is something important for treaty nations in Treaty 5 because, in my argument, which I've published, treaty nations too are relevant constitutional actors, which means your political action can change the Constitution. Work through Treaty 5. And what you do is you assert yourselves as we are the ones who decide what Treaty 5 means. We are the ones who decide how the government must relate to us. And you just do it. You do it. It's by your political action. If you insist on doing it, you insist and you do it in time and in accordance to the constitutional theory that we have in Canada, you can change the Constitution. Another way to do the same thing is through what is called the duty to consult. When you have consultations, you conduct yourself in particular ways, and that too can establish the law of the Constitution as you would like to have it. So you have to view this thing that you're doing, which has never been done before. You're trailblazers. You have to think about it, and you have to say, how do we want to change things? So I want to tell you, to give you a message of that you have, you're not without tools and without significance. You have a lot of constitutional significance. The other next point I want to mention is very, very complex and very, very convoluted. But I want to make a few comments about it because it's an idea that I think isn't all that useful, but so many people use it. And it's the idea of jurisdiction. If jurisdiction means that it comes from the Latin, it means to speak the law. That's what it means. But so it really refers to the power to make laws or the power to decide. So authority, that's what it means. So if you look at my model that I proposed of a nation-to-nation relationship, what's the answer to jurisdiction? You have all the power that you need to look after yourselves, after your interests, right? Belgium doesn't argue with Norway and say, Norway, you don't have authority over this, you have authority over that. And that's where at least my analysis has gone beyond what we said in RCAP. In RCAP, we propose a pretty complicated notion to deal with the concept of jurisdiction. But my view is this, that you don't need it. And you can challenge the government of Canada. You can say, nation to nation, if you have free, equal, and independent nations, then you have all the power that you need. So don't come to us saying, we don't recognize that you have this power over whatever you want. Nation to nation, that's what it means. So, one point on that is there are ready-made ideas for you to adopt. The biggest, most powerful treaty relationship on earth is the European Union. None of the countries in the European Union deny that another country has the power to make laws, but they have an agreement to share tasks. It comes by consent. And so their principle there that you'll find in the European Treaty, the Maastricht Treaty, is subsidiarity. So that's one big word that I'll throw out today, just because I want to tell you that under the nation-to-nation relationship, free, independent, equal nations, you have all the power you need. And if you want an example of how that's already working, look at the European Union. But people in Canada don't often look over in Europe. But we're a federal system here, and people have been bamboozled by governments telling you, no, you don't have this power, you don't have that power. So this idea gets rid of it. However, my job here is to talk a little bit about institutions of self-government. Institutions, ways of doing things. So the decisions that you have to make as Treaty 5 nations include a different meaning of jurisdiction. Because, at least according to the RCAP, you're not obligated to take on all the powers, to look after yourselves using all the powers. You have a right to choose. There are negotiating tables on certain sectors, for example. We're going to deal with, this subject or with that subject. So there are 4 things to keep in mind in jurisdiction. And it's for a treaty nation saying, okay, we're going to start out. We don't want to do everything. So you have a choice of saying we're going to undertake limited jurisdiction. That is, we're going to limit the subject matters over which we want to govern. The subject matter. So the first aspect of jurisdiction is subject matter jurisdiction. The second one is jurisdiction over the person. Who do you want to control? Who do you want to boss as a Treaty 5 nation? Do you want to boss only the people who belong to your treaty nation? Well, who is that? See, so you're going to need a membership code of some sort. Who belongs? Do you want control over the interests of those people alone? Or do you want control over anybody that comes onto your land? And that one brings in the third aspect of jurisdiction, which is territorial jurisdiction. Do you want to assert that you have jurisdiction or authority to govern anyone who comes on your territory, whether they belong to you or not? These are questions that you have to face. And finally, and I think this is the most important one for small nations, and that's where I think my suggestion on what nation-to-nation relationship means is helpful. It's respect. Equal, free, and independent nations respect one another. And the fourth part of jurisdiction for self-government purposes is, there's another big word, comity of nations. A comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, which means respect for the other's authority. So, for example, if a First Nation took control over a particular subject on reserve only, say, okay, we're governing this from now on, then a person breaches your law. But people travel, he's somewhere else, and he ends up in court. Federal court, he ends up in Queen's Bench Court. Is the court going to pay attention? Is the court going to respect your decision? That's called comity. That means respect for decisions made by the other nation. So that's the fourth part of jurisdiction. So as you can tell, the context for thinking about the creation of institutions is not straightforward. When you're thinking about it, you have to get an understanding of ideas that are basic and fundamental to the way that free, independent, and equal nations operate on. And you have to be reasonably familiar with a range of words, because I will say this, that for many people it's very tempting to worship words. And people will take a word and they will give it or assume that it has a definite meaning. They worship that word. They're seduced by that word. Words don't have natural meanings. Words mean whatever people decide they mean. I just gave an example when I started talking. So some of these young people, they use words they never heard before. They mean different things. They decided like that. I see new words every month. I'm blaming people from Ottawa. Rary lives there. I got to check with them. I say, who's the people making up all these goofy words that we see all over the place now? You know, some of them don't make any sense to me. You know, so who makes that up? So it's freedom. But language is very, very, very important. Language is very important. So you have to look behind the word to understand its true meaning. I'm going to come now to the end part, which is to identify particular options concerning institutions of government, and I want to make a few points about each one of them. I just want to say something that I kind of forgot or skated over in my quick notes here, because I'm trying to do justice to the forum here and not take all that much time. I didn't go through a detailed review, as I thought I might, of the constitutional evolution of Canada. But I want to mention and I want to honor a Treaty 5 person who was a friend of mine for his contribution to the evolution of the Canadian Constitution, and that's the late Elijah Harper from Red Sucker Lake, who, as you will know, said no in the Manitoba legislature and helped to kill the Meech Lake Accord. And he'll go down in history before that, but I'll tell you just a little story about it. One time, I was in Toronto Airport with Elijah. I think it was Toronto or Ottawa, and we were flying back to Winnipeg, I guess. And it was at the time around about '87, the Meech Lake Accord and that, and he was in the news a lot. And his picture was all over the place, and so people were staring at him everywhere, and I was really embarrassed because I used to people staring at me like that, and they were staring because I was walking with them, and we sat down to have a coffee or something before the flight took off, and so some man came and wanted his autograph, and so Elijah signed it, Elijah Harper, MLA. At that time, he was a member of the Manitoba legislature. And then he gives the man back his business card and he says, MLA. That does not mean Meech Lake Accord, he said. but anyway, he had a lot of really good lines, and I borrow them every once in a while, like, after lunch. I could have used it today, but I wasn't the first speaker after lunch, but he was one time. He said, now that we're all fed up. Another one I think I used the last time I spoke to a treaty group one time, and I said this. I said, I'd like to say a few words before I speak. Anyway, but I always try to acknowledge the people that said things, some of which illustrate my point that I think we were born with an enlarged funny bone. Here's something that I find worrisome about this nation-to-nation policy. The policy led to the split of Indian affairs. One is called Canadian Indigenous CIRNA, Canadian Indigenous, Crown Indigenous Relations Department. That's Minister Bennett's. And this, they said, well, this was recommended by that Royal Commission that I served on. Okay, and the reason is this, our thinking. The basic reason is that it's not going to work if you have bureaucrats that have power over treaty nations because they're providing them with services, negotiating their way away from them. Come on. There's a rule. Institutions once created don't die, they don't go away. It's a conflict of interest. So you have to get rid of that conflict of interest. So that's why you have to have another department, because people must not be forced to negotiate a self-government agreement. So Treaty 5, you don't have to say, we're going to govern ourselves just like Treaty 5 recognizes. You don't have to. So we'll create another department to continue providing the services that it does for as long as people want them. But that's an interim measure until you get your own agreement which includes financing and access to resources and transfer payments and fiscal resources and so on. But I have reason to be concerned that what I see happening doesn't seem to be created for a government to get away from control and to get away from a situation where it has a conflict of interest in negotiating self-government agreements. And the reason is this. I've seen it advertised, and some of you may be involved with this, that the Services Department, DISC, is involved, that's Minister Philpott's department, is involved in negotiating new legislation on child welfare services. Well, that has to do with agreement on taking on new authority. That doesn't sound to me like a department that's intended to die on the vine, to continue to provide services until such time as it's no longer needed because treaty nations have acquired their agreement on state indigenous relationships. So I think that's a matter of concern. There are other concerns, of course, including our proposal that the Ministry of Crown Relations ought to have budgetary control over all Aboriginal-related initiatives in all the different departments. And Minister Bennett doesn't have that. I wrote an article on this in Maclean's magazine, so if you wanted to read about that one, you could just Google it. I want to conclude by mentioning a few of the kinds of institutions that are available to treaty nations that wish to create a proper treaty relationship with Canada. There are a number of them, and I want to emphasize at the beginning that most of these are not established institutions. Exactly how they're going to work, how they're going to be built is still pretty fuzzy. And who's going to decide exactly how they're going to work and take the fuzz away? You. As I said initially, you're doing things that haven't been done before. So you're in a position then, if the nation-to-nation relationship really means something, where free, independent, and equal nations are meeting to reach an agreement, then you can decide how these institutions will work out. And I'm just going to mention them briefly. One is that you decide that you want to fit in within the federal system of Canada. Canada is a federal system, federal government, and provincial governments. So there's a number of options, but they involve the provinces. One of them, which is made by Professor Tom Crushane from Queen's University, and he's got a recent book on it. He suggests, well, you could create an Aboriginal province with province-like powers. That's one way to plug yourself in, as it were, to the Canadian federal constitutional system. And the attraction for a kind of institution that follows provincial lines and federal lines is that in our experience, we know that provincial power trumps treaty rights. Provincial power trumps treaty rights. I didn't say provincial rights. I said provincial power trumps treaty rights. And I'll just give you one or two examples. One is the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement of 1975 with its later amendments. The agreement ended where? At the Ontario boundary. So what's the difference between the Cree on this side of the border and the Cree on the other side of the border? You see? So you will know as well from your experience that it's not easy to deal with, more than the province in which your reserve boundaries lie. So that's why we can say, I think, legitimately, that provincial power trumps treaty rights, and you have to consider that, and you have to change it, and you have to look at, well, what power do we have to challenge provincial power? There's not that many sources of power in Canada, of political power. What do you have? You can influence public opinion, which will influence votes. You use money, and you can use civil disobedience. Those are the only sources of power that I can think of. And then you have to decide, how much of these have I got? What kind of leverage have I got? Rights mean something. Rights mean something. But I'm going to tell you a fact that comes from international experience to tell you that rights are usually best nurtured, best respected in places that have respect for rights. And if your rights are not respected, they don't count for anything. Human rights included. I saw at the UN countries that are dictatorships. They deny that there's indigenous people there. They happily accepted the declaration. Well, we don't have any. You see, I remember one story when I was living in Australia. There was an Indonesian general, and his soldiers had just gone, and there was 1,000 people, and they'd killed about 500 of them or something like that. And the news reporter asked that general, they said, an Australian news reporter said, your people killed 500 out of those 900 people. What do you have to say? And of course, they're thinking he's going to say something to excuse himself. No, said he was really mad because they didn't kill them all. So the thing is, rights only go so far. Rights are only good for people who are going to respect them for whatever reason. So those reasons are usually hard-nosed reasons, and it's a tough world. So it's not easy to, you can claim rights, but that doesn't mean everybody's going to pay attention. So that's the context in which, you're going to be blazing a trail, as it were, to make that Treaty 5 effective in that state-indigenous relationship. One other thing that might help, another kind of institution, and we looked at this one when I was on that provincial Aboriginal Justice Commission, which is the round table. They've got experience with that in Manitoba. You get a round table where you get representatives of treaty nations, you get a representative of government, and you get representatives of private industry. And you get them to meet, fairly informally, and they get a little secretariat to help them to do research and whatever. And you get together and try to see how you can work together. So some people think that's one way to try to make progress and trying to move ahead. But that's for the province. As I said, what I was looking at now is institutions that engage the province. What I want to comment on a little bit now, briefly, and there's only almost done, is for those of you who want to know when you have to wake up, is introducing your own laws. To introduce your own laws. So in light of what I said, there's no question. If you want to introduce your own laws, you have to do it. You can just do it. But for a lot of treaty nations, your law is not written on a wall, or it's not written in a book. So that's a bit of a dilemma, but we've got the experience from a number of quarters to help us to understand how you can go about making your own laws effective. One of the important things to remember is language. That the best depictions of your laws are going to be found inside your language. It's a challenge to go outside your language to explain those laws. So you need experts in your language to help you find your laws and to describe them. The language is of fundamental importance. The other thing is this. Treaty nations, First Nation people now have been living under the yoke of Canadian government for several generations. Rory there knows a lot about generations and stuff, and he has great-great-great-grandfathers and so on. So you can count the generations under which people have been under control. And so you've become accustomed, because of your environment, to think about laws as rules. If you do this, then, this is the rule. And if you break the rule applies to everybody, and then you get this, what we call sanction. There's a result. Something happens. Often something unpleasant to you. So that's a rules-based approach to law. But there are other approaches to law. And one of them can be described as a values-based approach to law. Instead of saying, here's a rule, you look inside your language and you ask, what is important to us that tells us how people should get along? What's important to us that tells us how people within a family should get along? The children, the parents, the other relations. How should you behave with your neighbors? How should you behave with strangers? These are, so the way you behave is decided not by a rule, but by a value. And I've been privileged in listening to elders from a number of places in the world where they have talked about their old laws, their traditional laws. And this is, I understand, I think that's what they were talking about. So I think it's important to look at the language and to look at the things that the people value, and that will, I think, in a lot of cases, be the foundation for your law. Of course, in modern agreements, it's going to be almost necessary to write them. Because in my understanding from listening to elders, the laws are flexible because you have that value, and then when something happens, then those who decide will ask themselves, in light of this idea that we have, how should we deal with this situation? And they talk about it. And let me just say quickly that I have friends, the Navajo Nation, who have a lot of experience in developing Navajo laws. And one of the things they say to me, which I want to pass on for you to think about, talking it out. They say there's a lot of value talking it out. So if there's a dispute between people, you create an institution to allow people to talk it out. So I think that's a valuable idea, is to say, look, instead of having these rules, can you have instead a different way of dealing with the application of your laws? You create a place that everybody understands, and you get together and you talk it out. So that's another institution. That's an institution. Another thing that is a major gap in making Treaty 5, the relationship with Canada, effective, a major gap is Canada's not complying with international standards that require the state to recognize what we call the juridical status of the treaty nations, of First Nations. What that means is that the system in Canada, as in other countries, must have a way of giving legal recognition to your existence. Right now, when people go to court, they sometimes go as a Indian Act band, or you can go to court as a corporate body. If you look at the modern treaties or self-government agreements, let's say like the West Bank self-government agreement, it has a provision that says West Bank has these two lines of authority. One, to make these laws that are agreed here, and also the capacity, legal capacity of a natural person, which is legal talk, which means you're able to enter into contracts and so on and have legal relations with other people. And so some of you will know, TFAO is an example, that the government usually requires, it doesn't pay attention to Treaty 5 as such, or to the descendant signatories who signed the adhesion in 1910. Betsy Anderson was there. That signing group and its descendants are not recognized as having the legal authority in the courts. That's the juridical status. And that standard, that a state must do that, is found in the OAS Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You may not have heard about that, but like you've heard of the UN Declaration, there's another declaration that involves North and South American countries. And it was declared about 2-3 years ago, I forget offhand, and that's one of the standards that's in that declaration that is not in the UN Declaration. And the final institution that I'm going to mention is contract and arbitration. This is a very technical one. There's a legal way in which you can organize your relations with other people through contract. This could be handy for a First Nation that wants to govern itself but doesn't really know how to deal with strangers that are on your land. So you can require the teachers and whoever that they sign a contract and they agree that if there's any dispute, the dispute will be resolved with an arbitration. And then you can create your own arbitration, or you can go to the general arbitration system. So that's another thing that's available. And I was going to tell you another 5 quick funny stories there, Dennis, but he's telling me my time's up, so I'm just kidding. So I'm going to say thank you very much for your kind attention. You're welcome on all my relations.